The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the sprawling 10-acre property that had been my sanctuary for the past 2 decades. The land, nestled far from the chaos of city life, was more than just a piece of real estate. It was my haven. I had built the house with my own hands, brick by brick, and the land had become an extension of myself. My 2 German shepherds, Max and Duke, roamed freely, their barks echoing through the quiet woods. Life was simple, peaceful, and entirely mine. That peace was shattered the day the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, HOA, moved in next door. The development was a stark contrast to my rustic lifestyle. Rows of identical, overpriced houses with perfectly manicured lawns and white picket fences lined the streets. The residents of Maple Ridge seemed to live in a bubble, oblivious to the world beyond their gated community. I had hoped they would keep to themselves, but it didn't take long for their sense of entitlement to spill over onto my land. It started with a simple intrusion. One morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I noticed a group of people casually strolling across my property. A woman in yoga pants led the pack, followed by a man walking a tiny dog and 2 kids on scooters. They were cutting through my private driveway as if it were a public sidewalk. I set my coffee down and approached them. "Excuse me, can I help you?" The woman, a short blonde with a pastel cardigan, smiled at me as if I were the one out of place. "Oh, we're just taking the new community shortcut," she said cheerfully. "Shortcut?" I frowned. "This is private property." She nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, the HOA decided this path is better access to the park. We've been using it all week." I crossed my arms. "Lady, this is my land. There's no community shortcut here." Her smile faltered for the first time. "Oh, we already discussed it at the last HOA meeting." "It's been decided." "Decided by who?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. "The board, of course," she replied, as if that explained everything. I took a deep breath. "I don't care what your board decided. This land isn't yours. It's private property." Her smile tightened. "Well, we'll see about that." I watched as they walked back toward their neighborhood, whispering among themselves. Little did I know, that was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to find HOA signs posted on my property. "Community walking path. HOA rules apply," they read. They had just declared war, and they had no idea who they were messing with. I stepped outside, expecting a quiet day, but instead, I found a bright red envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a notice of noncompliance, stating that my property was now subject to HOA regulations and must adhere to community guidelines, including accessibility for common use areas. Failure to comply would result in legal action. I let out a slow chuckle. They really thought this would work. Most people panic when they receive official-looking letters. They see legal threats and immediately fall in line. But I'm not most people. I marched straight to the HOA office, kicked open the door, and slammed the letter onto the counter. "Who the hell wrote this garbage?" I demanded. A snippy-looking woman in thick glasses peered over her computer. "Sir, if you're here to dispute an HOA violation, you'll need to file an appeal with the board." I scoffed. "I don't belong to your HOA. There's nothing to appeal." She pursed her lips. "Oh, you must be Mr. Carter." Before I could respond, I heard heels clicking against the tile, and then she walked in, Margaret Maggie Thompson, the HOA president. She was the epitome of suburban entitlement, dressed in a tailored suit and wearing a smug expression. "Ah, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I was expecting you." She gestured to a chair, but I didn't sit. "Let's be reasonable here," she continued. "The HOA has decided that it's in the best interest of the community to include your land as part of our shared outdoor space." I blinked. "You decided that?" "Funny, because I don't recall voting on it." She laughed, as if I were too dumb to understand. "Oh, James, it doesn't work like that. The board makes these decisions." I crossed my arms. "And what legal authority does your board have over my private property?" Her smile flickered. "Well, according to the HOA charter." "I don't belong to your HOA," I interrupted. She let out a dramatic sigh. "Well, we had an emergency vote and annexed your property into the association. So, technically, you're now a member." I stared at her. "You annexed my property?" She nodded smugly. "Yes, so now you need to follow HOA guidelines. That includes allowing residents to use the walking path and paying the monthly dues. I burst out laughing. You actually think that's legal? I leaned forward, placing my hands on the counter. Listen real close, sweetheart. You can't just vote to take someone's land. That's not how property laws work. And unless you've got my signature on some contract, this little letter of yours means nothing. Maggie's face turned red. You can't just refuse. The community has spoken. I took a step closer. Well, let me be clear. I've spoken too, and the answer is no. She clenched her jaw. We'll see about that. I turned to leave, but not before adding, send as many of those letters as you want. They make great kindling for my fire pit. I wasn't stupid. I knew people like Maggie didn't take no for an answer. So, I installed cameras around my property and waited. 3 nights later, those cameras caught the HOA sneaking onto my land. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room, lights off, watching the security feeds. Every time a branch rustled or a shadow shifted, my fingers tightened around the 12-gauge shotgun resting across my lap. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. At 3:42 a.m., my motion sensor tripped. The camera feed flickered on, and there they were, 3 figures in reflective vests, sneaking onto my property. Each one carried wooden stakes and metal signs. And right in the middle, giving orders like a damn general, was Maggie Thompson. I switched to the front camera. 2 more figures were moving toward my porch. They weren't just trespassing, they were coming inside. I grabbed my shotgun and moved toward the front door. Then I heard it, the metallic clatter of bolt cutters snapping my gate lock. They were getting bolder. I flicked off the safety and waited. The doorknob turned. I raised the shotgun, aiming directly at the entrance. A soft click. They had picked the lock. The door inched open. You take one more step, and I swear to God, you won't be walking back out, I said, my voice low and steady. The first man froze mid-step. Maggie, still outside, hissed, "What's the holdup?" Then she saw me. The color drained from her face. One of the men reached toward his waist, and I fired a warning shot into the air. The explosion rattled the porch. Maggie screamed and dove for the ground. The 2 men in the doorway bolted, and the others outside took off running, dropping their signs and stakes as they tripped over themselves. Maggie scrambled to her feet, her face twisted with rage. "You're insane," she shrieked. "I'm calling the cops." I smirked. Good, because I was about to do the same thing. I stepped back inside, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. Maggie's eyes went wide. "Wait, you're actually calling the sheriff?" "Oh yeah," I said. "Let's see how this plays out." She took one last look at me, then turned and ran. By the time the sheriff pulled up 20 minutes later, the HOA was long gone. It didn't matter. I had everything on camera. And now, I was done playing nice. The next morning, I was expecting a call from the sheriff, maybe an update or even some arrests. Instead, I woke up to cops at my front door, not for an investigation, but for me. 2 deputies stood on my porch, hands resting on their belts. And standing right behind them, smirking like she had already won, was Maggie Thompson. "Mr. Carter," one of the deputies said, "we need to talk." I folded my arms. I already gave my statement. The taller cop, a grizzled guy with sharp eyes, nodded. "We're not here about last night. Your HOA president has filed a complaint against you. She's claiming you brandished a firearm and threatened members of the community." I had to bite back a laugh. "You mean the armed men who broke into my house?" Maggie cut in immediately. "It wasn't a break-in," she snapped. "We were performing a routine compliance check. He's a danger to this neighborhood." The younger cop glanced at his notepad. "She claims you fired at them." I didn't even blink. "You want to see the footage?" Maggie froze. The smirk on her face disappeared instantly. Sheriff Harris scratched his head. "Figured you'd have some." I gestured toward the house. "Come inside." I saved all the clips. Maggie held up her hands. "I don't think we need to." "Ma'am," Harris cut her off. "You filed a police report. That means we need to see the evidence." Inside, I pulled up my security camera footage on the TV. There it was, clear as day. Maggie and her HOA sneaking onto my land. Maggie giving orders to stake new signs. The men trying to break into my house, and me firing a single warning shot into the air. The entire time, not once was a gun pointed at them. The officers watched the screen in silence. Then Harris turned to his deputy. "Well, that clears that up." Maggie's face turned bright red. "But you saw, he had a gun. He's dangerous." Harris crossed his arms. What I saw was you in your HOA trespassing on private property. Maggie's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Then Harris pulled out his notepad. Actually, Carter, do you want to press charges for trespassing and harassment? Maggie choked on air. What? She shrieked. I leaned back in my chair. Yeah, I think I do. Harris clicked his pen. All right then. He turned to Maggie. Ma'am, I'll need you to come down to the station for questioning. She looked like she was about to faint. This is ridiculous, she screamed. He's the criminal. He's a menace. Harris smirked. And yet, he's the one with evidence. Maggie turned to her 2 HOA board members standing behind her, but they were already backing away, pretending they didn't know her. She had lost. After the sheriff left, I knew I had to dig deeper. I went to the county office and asked for any property records tied to my land. The clerk frowned, tapping at her keyboard, then looked up, confused. Sir, there's nothing filed under your address. I wasn't surprised. What about HOA filings? She frowned again, typing in the neighborhood's name. Then her eyes widened. She turned the monitor toward me. The HOA had been illegally filing permit requests under homeowner addresses, not real permits, fake ones. And each one had outrageous fees attached to it. Some homeowners had been charged thousands of dollars for renovations they never even did. And those who refused to pay had their homes flagged for noncompliance. That's when it hit me. The fines, the fake violations, the intimidation. This wasn't just about power trips. Maggie and her HOA weren't just extorting people. They were stealing from them. I started calling other homeowners. The stories were all the same. One guy had paid $8,000 in permit fees for a garage renovation he never did. A woman down the street had been forced to rip out her entire driveway because the HOA claimed it was non-compliant. They had all been scammed, and now they wanted justice. The local news caught wind of the story within 24 hours. Then the state got involved. Turns out, this wasn't just happening in our neighborhood. Maggie and her board had been running the same scam in multiple communities. Fake violations, forced removals, bogus legal threats, and millions of dollars in stolen fees. The district attorney launched a full-scale criminal investigation. Suddenly, Maggie's own board members started flipping on her. Facing prison time, they turned over emails, financial records, and proof of everything. The scheme went deeper than anyone imagined. Maggie was charged with wire fraud, forgery, racketeering, conspiracy to commit extortion, multiple counts of trespassing, and harassment. The entire HOA board was charged as well. Maggie wasn't just facing a few years in prison, she was looking at decades. And the best part? Even after her arrest, her problems weren't over. The homeowners sued. A massive class action lawsuit was filed, demanding every stolen dollar back. By the time it was over, Maggie lost everything: her money, her home, her entire reputation. The neighborhood was finally free. A few weeks later, I received one last letter. This time, it wasn't a threat or a fine. It was a formal statement. The Homeowners Association for Maple Ridge has been officially disbanded. I read it twice, then framed it and hung it in my living room. Just as a reminder that no matter how much power they think they have, there's always one thing they can't take: a man's right to stand his ground. Because they tried to force me out, but the Second Amendment stopped them for good. The neighborhood was quiet again, the way it had been before Maple Ridge and its HOA had tried to impose their will. The signs were gone, the fake permits were nullified, and the people who had been victimized by Maggie's schemes were finally able to breathe easy. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise over the 10 acres that had been my home for 20 years. Max and Duke lounged at my feet, their tails wagging lazily. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. But I knew better than to let my guard down completely. People like Maggie Thompson didn't go down without a fight, and I had no doubt that there were others out there who would try to take what wasn't theirs. I had learned a lot from the ordeal. I had learned that sometimes standing your ground meant more than just holding onto your property. It meant standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. And as I looked out over the land that I had fought so hard to protect, I knew that I would do it all over again if I had to. Because this wasn't just about me. It was about the principle of the thing. It was about freedom, independence, and the right to live your life on your own terms. The Maple Ridge HOA was gone, but the lessons I had learned would stay with me forever. And as long as I had my land, my dogs, and my shotgun, I knew I would always be ready for whatever came next. Months passed, and life on my 10-acre property returned to a semblance of normalcy. The Maple Ridge HOA was disbanded, Maggie Thompson was behind bars, and the neighborhood was finally free from her tyranny. But peace, as I had come to learn, was often fleeting. It started with small things, strange noises at night, tire tracks on the edge of my property, and the occasional feeling that I was being watched. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. After everything that had happened, it was hard not to be on edge. But when I found a broken lock on my gate one morning, I knew something was wrong. I checked the security cameras, but whoever had tampered with the lock had done so just out of view. It was a calculated move, and it sent a chill down my spine. Someone was testing me, probing for weaknesses. I reinforced the locks, added more cameras, and made sure Max and Duke were always on patrol. But the unease lingered. Whoever was out there, they weren't amateurs. One evening, as I was sorting through the mail, I found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. You think you won, but the game isn't over. You took down Maggie, but you don't know who's really pulling the strings. Be careful, Carter. They're coming for you. The letter was unsigned, but the tone was ominous. I didn't know whether to take it seriously or dismiss it as a prank. But the timing was too coincidental. Someone was sending me a warning or a threat. I called Sheriff Harris to report the letter, but without any leads, there wasn't much he could do. Keep your eyes open, he advised. And don't take any chances. I didn't plan to. The first real attack came a week later. I was in the barn, cleaning my tools, when I heard Max and Duke barking furiously. I grabbed my shotgun and ran outside, only to see two figures in black hoodies sprinting toward the tree line. I fired a warning shot into the air, and they disappeared into the woods. By the time I reached the edge of the property, they were gone. But they had left something behind, a can of gasoline and a box of matches. They weren't just trying to intimidate me, they were trying to burn me out. I called the sheriff again, and this time, he took it seriously. A team was dispatched to search the woods, but they found nothing. Whoever these people were, they knew the area well. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I started digging into Maggie's past. If there was someone else pulling the strings, I needed to know who they were. I reached out to the district attorney's office and requested access to the files from Maggie's case. What I found was disturbing. Maggie had been in contact with a man named Victor Langston, a wealthy real estate developer with a reputation for shady dealings. Langston had been funding Maggie's HOA schemes, using them as a front to acquire land for his development projects. When Maggie was arrested, Langston had disappeared, leaving no trace. But now it seemed he was back. One night, as I was reviewing the security footage, I noticed a pattern. The intruders always came from the same direction, the old logging road that ran through the woods behind my property. It was overgrown and rarely used, but it provided the perfect cover for someone who wanted to move unseen. I decided to set a trap. I placed motion-activated cameras along the road and rigged a few tripwires with flares. If they came back, I'd be ready. 2 nights later, the trap was sprung. The cameras caught 3 figures moving cautiously down the road. When they triggered the tripwire, the flares lit up the night, and I was waiting for them. I stepped out of the shadows, shotgun in hand. You've got 3 seconds to explain why you're on my land, I said, my voice cold and steady. One of the men raised his hands. We're just following orders, he said. We don't want any trouble. Whose orders? I demanded. The man hesitated, then said, Victor Langston. He wants your land, and he's not going to stop until he gets it. With the information I had, I went to Sheriff Harris. Together, we set up a sting operation to catch Langston in the act. We planted false information that I was willing to sell my land, and sure enough, Langston took the bait. The night of the meeting, I waited in the barn, my shotgun resting across my lap. Langston arrived in a black SUV, flanked by 2 bodyguards. He stepped out, his expensive suit gleaming in the moonlight. Mr. Carter, he said with a smug smile. I hear you've come to your senses. I stood up, shotgun in hand. Not quite. At that moment, Sheriff Harris and his deputies emerged from the shadows, guns drawn. Victor Langston, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, trespassing, and extortion, Harris said. Langston's smile faded. You have no proof, he sneered. We have your men, I said, gesturing to the bodyguards, who were already in cuffs. And we have you. Langston's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. His empire of corruption crumbled as more evidence came to light. He had been using fake HOAs and shell companies to steal land from homeowners across the state, and his arrest brought justice to countless victims. As for me, I finally felt safe. The threats were gone, and my land was secure. But I knew better than to let my guard down completely. The world was full of people like Maggie and Langston, and I would always be ready to defend what was mine. Months later, I stood on my porch, watching the sun rise over the 10 acres that had been my home for over 20 years. Max and Duke lounged at my feet, their tails wagging lazily. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves and the gentle breeze. I had fought hard to protect this land, and I had won. But the battle had changed me. I had learned that sometimes standing your ground meant more than just holding onto your property. It meant standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. As I looked out over the land, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The Maple Ridge HOA was gone, Langston was behind bars, and the neighborhood was finally free. But I knew that peace was fragile, and I would always be ready to defend it. Because this wasn't just about me, it was about the principle of the thing. It was about freedom, independence, and the right to live your life on your own terms. And as long as I had my land, my dogs, and my shotgun, I knew I would always be ready for whatever came next. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.